Did you know that being trans in medieval Europe actually wasn't all that bad? Caveat, being a straight, binary trans person. This is because in medieval Europe, gender was so structured in terms of clothing, mannerisms, and gender roles that as long as you socially presented yourself as one gender or the other in a strong way, you pretty much passed. There are multiple medieval accounts of both trans men and trans women who were only discovered upon their deaths, including the story of a trans man who, at the time, was accused and found guilty of fathering an illegitimate son with some local townswoman. Despite knowing this was an impossibility for him, he still raised his son without quarrel. Of course, with the immense amount of bigotry and hatred of cross-dressing in medieval Europe, trans folk did find themselves on trial. However, these trials largely focused on trying to determine the gender identity of the individuals to try and decide whether the crimes of sodomy or cross-dressing had occurred. For example, a trans woman who presented herself with a feminine dress and a feminine name and had been with men had a valid argument in the medieval court simply by saying, "I'm a woman." It was people such as the very famous Joan of Arc who was determined to be a woman and therefore was guilty of the crime of cross-dressing that got punishment.
History is written by the victors. The line, often attributed to Winston Churchill, is hotly debated. Some argue that this is not the case. Writers write history. The history is always there, just not in the public eye or maybe not listened to because of who is speaking it. To an extent, this is true. For example, the Moai statues of Easter Island, as told in oral history, walked to their destination. Researchers did not believe this, but years later realized by pulling on either side, the statues could, quote-unquote, walk. Oral histories of the Washoe speak of attempting to help the donor party, who refused their help and instead decided to resort to cannibalism. The Japanese call them comfort women and have yet to apologize to the Korean and Chinese women stolen from their homes and pressed into sexual slavery, but their stories are there if you choose to look for them. If you listen to these stories, if you look for them, if you make an effort, they are there. However, the history presented as truthful and honest, the ones taught in schools and the ones we all commonly know, are controlled by the dominant ideological group. We can change how we interpret the past to suit current motives better. This is especially true when it comes to discussing oppression, particularly regarding gender and sexuality. Although many argue that we have reached a state of gendered equilibrium, there's still much progress to be made for women to be treated as equal to men. As is true after every wave of feminism, this wave attempts to ignore the past by painting it as being not as bad, but refusing to understand the intensity, barbarity, and severity of women's oppression historically. Additionally, this can be seen in the current LGBT community, namely the queer umbrella, wherein to support the addition of identities that fall under the queer umbrella, there's a need to validate them with a history that simply does not exist.
The hero of France, Joan of Arc, will be portrayed as a non-binary.
Oh no, Joan of Arc, the person that's supposed to be set on fire instead of wearing women's clothes during a time where wearing women's clothing was the same as admitting to perform all their roles and being forever seen as a woman. They're not seeing that person as a woman. Oh my god. A person that said it made God happy if they dressed like a man, if they went to church just as a man, they're saying that that person may not have been cis. Wow. I can't believe they are saying that the person that chose to be set on fire instead of being seen as a woman isn't being seen as a woman. That is awful. That is truly, they're just taking that away from women, aren't they? I can't do this.
Homosexuals have always existed. There's been a long history of homosexuality, and homosexuals attempting to fight for rights and acceptance. Gay liberation did not occur over 10 years, unlike many modern identities, which have only been invented post-2010, and that's a generous time frame. It was a long, hard battle that took place worldwide in a different context and was primarily fought by gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, despite modern attempts to rewrite that history as being led by transgender individuals. When attempting to validate these new identities, many people point to examples of gender nonconformity from the past as an example of transgenderism, non-binaryism, or some other form of third gender. However, not only is this racist, but controlling the past means not owning up to the historical events, particularly the understanding that misogyny is a widespread and worldwide affliction, and that homosexuality is treated much the same. Many like to point out that there weren't many laws against lesbians. However, the truth is that they simply weren't needed. When women were not allowed to own property, work jobs, or be treated as humans, there was no need to legislate or make it legal to have homosexual relationships between women because they were already sequestered in the home. Women were essentially property to be passed between father to husband. The lack of independence meant that there was no chance of having visible female homosexuality because women were already severely oppressed. Meanwhile, many homosexuals could be bachelors, could choose who to spend time with, and decide not to marry. Hence why additional laws were needed to restrict and criminalize male homosexuality. Some women attempted to escape the binds of misogyny and strict gender roles by dressing as men and taking on male roles or appearances. These women accomplished notable and remarkable things. For example, James Berry is widely considered to be the first woman doctor. The first search result for her assumed name refers to her as male.
A quick story about a person who outsmarted the system of the time to display their greatness. Dr. James Berry graduated school at 22 and rose to the ranks to become the British Army surgeon. Dr. James Berry was also one of the first Europeans to perform a successful C-section on a woman in Africa. In 1857, Dr. James Berry became the Inspector General of the hospitals in Canada, where Dr. James Berry made great improvements for the poor black people at the hospitals in Canada. When Dr. James Berry died, the Army suppressed Dr. James Berry records for decades. However, it was finally revealed that Dr. James Berry was really a woman born Margaret Ann Bulkley. You see, at the time, women weren't allowed to be doctors, but Mary Ann Bulkley, well, Dr. James Berry, didn't let that stop them from being great. And that's too factual. Peace.
Joan of Arc refused to wear a dress in jail, as wearing trousers served as protection and deterrent against rape, which resulted in her being sentenced to death for defying the biblical verse Deuteronomy, which said that women should not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, despite priests like St. Thomas Aquinas, who admitted that there are valid reasons for doing so, either in order to hide oneself from enemies, or through lack of other clothes, or for some similar motive. A recent play regards her as non-binary. However, instead of acknowledging that taking on male gender roles was a method of escaping the bindings of being female and the position described to females, today, people prefer to look back on this as being a validation for viewing people who are non-conforming as being not of their sex. Because Hatshepsut wore a beard and ruled as a pharaoh and not a queen, she was actually a man, because women don't do that. Women can't have political power.
And here we have Her Majesty the King. What type of gay Yup, there was a queer Egyptian king. Sadly, she was murdered after her death. What? 3,000 years ago, Egyptian king Thutmose II died. His son was next to become the king, but he was a baby. So instead, Hatshepsut, who was Thutmose II's wife and mother of Thutmose III, took the throne. She didn't want the title of queen or regent. She chose to declare herself as king, then presented herself with a fake beard, male headdress, and changed her name to the male version of her name. But she still used she/her pronouns, referring to herself as Her Majesty the King. She was one of the best pharaohs to ever live. She grew the economy, was an iconic builder, and strengthened the military, all without bloodshed. The community loved her. Then she got murdered, kind of. Stay tuned for part 2.
I don't like Barbie dolls and wearing makeup or high heels, so that must mean that I'm a man, because all women enjoy doing these things. How are the two statements any different? Both statements help define womanhood as being made up of the stereotypes placed upon us and implies enjoyment of the oppression we face if we do not opt out by deciding to identify as something else. Attempting to fit historical figures into modern categories doesn't allow for any contextualization of the lives these people led, or how they had to make specific choices to live their lives the way they did. The same can be said of the third gender concept, which is just another example of the argument that, obviously, white people, the Western world, colonialism brought misogyny and homophobia to non-white countries. Many like to point to third genders existing in far-off places, despite the speaker coming from a Western country, as being an example of why non-binary and other modern identities are valid. Not only is this a strange excuse, as you do not belong to those cultures and therefore would have no claim to those identities in the first place, but it also ignores that there were rules placed on men who were gender nonconforming to make them fit in to a rigid gender hierarchy. Homosexuals were still men, but they were considered lesser than men who were with women. And so they had to create another category in order to fit those men in, as to make an excuse to where men could have sex with them and not be tainted by the gender nonconformity, while still allowing those men to be in a different category from women who were oppressed on a basis of sexual reproduction. Even in these examples of third genders, those men who were in that extra category are placed in a specific group that allows other men to be over them and for them to still remain over women. You'll notice that very few third genders, in fact, I've only ever seen maybe one or two, include women, and that is because women did not have the choice to opt out of the gender roles ascribed to their sex. Third genders are just another way to contextualize misunderstandings regarding homosexuality, and a way to repackage homosexuality modernly as a way to support genderism. Rewriting gender nonconformity and homosexuality as being examples of transgenderism erases homosexuality and the context of those people's lives. To just say that Joan of Arc didn't want to wear a dress because she was just different than the other girls ignores that she was imprisoned in a place where rape was rampant and that wearing pants was the one way to protect her chastity. Ignoring the fact that homosexual men in different cultures didn't have the choice of retaining the power ascribed to them and had no choice but to be placed in that category. All of that shatters the idea that you can choose your identity when you can't. There are some things that you can choose about how you identify, but you can't really identify out of how the world treats you. And to historically change these things, I mean, historical revisionism, it's nothing new, I suppose. Just look at Stonewall and how many people believe lies rather than what truly happened that night. This, dear viewers, is where we part. I'm really tired of this. I saw a tweet about it, and then I barfed out this video. So I hope you like it. I'm considering doing a book review of Ellen Page's book because I think I think it's a good one to do a commentary on. I'm trying to find a good copy of it to read from because I don't want to pay for it. On top of that, I'm considering doing some videos that are a little bit off of my usual path because there's going to be a Kung Fu Panda 4. And it's been a minute since I was a cartoon review channel, but most of what I watch these days are reruns from when I was a child. I'm very normal. And I would like to do one on power scaling and media and how that kind of ruins stories, as well as maybe something about zombies, because I also really love zombies. There's a lot of things that I've been hiding so you don't see how cringe I am. The country music, the cartoon obsession. I hope you don't mind those too much. But I do have a lot of other videos hopefully coming out soon that'll be touching these topics, and I'm working on some long videos that are a pain in the butt because they're going to take hours to write and record and hours to edit, and YouTube's going to murder me with the content things, and I already have most of these demonetized recently because I'm so good at picking videos, but it's fine. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.